All right,
So,
cool.
Kevin, I want to really thank you for being with me today. This is my first weekend in Barbados, and I'm just really thrilled to talk with you about important topics of human rights and history. And we're here at Colleton House, and
Yeah,
it has it's a beautiful building with a tragic history. And
yeah.
I'd love for you to tell us about what this means and why history matters.
Wow. Well, thanks for having me. Why history matters, that could be a couple days discussion. But the importance of why we're here, we're at Colleton. And Colleton intersects with Barbadian and American history in maybe two ways, but all coming out of the same source. And it has to do with colonization and enslavement. So Colleton is really the space from which the settlement of South Carolina happens.
Hmm.
So Colleton and some other planters had put together an adventure company to go and find new lands, which they did. And they came back and had found that there was really fertile land along the Cape Fear. And they got other people interested, got the money together, and went and populated that area on the Cape Fear. That turned into Charleston.
Hmm.
So for, let's call it maybe 50, 60 years of the early settlement of South Carolina, there's a real symbiotic relationship between the Carolinas and Barbados, down to the point that South Carolina is divided into parishes. That the House of Burgesses is kind of formulated on the House of Parliament here in Barbados, and that so many of those early governors and leading men of that day were Barbadian planters who relocated, or their families who relocated, and created. It seems interesting and weird to say it this way, but then created provisioning plantations in the Carolinas that provided wood, apples, um, and then rice to Barbados in exchange for rum and molasses, and the exchange of enslaved people between them early on. And the spread of enslavement in that transatlantic world is a way embodied in this house. And then we skip 200 years
Hmm.
later, because one of the legacies of enslavement is the creation of racial laws and racism as an ideology. And we have Nina Simone living in this house in the
This exact
1970s.
house.
This exact house.
Wow.
This exact house. In fact, she has an album called House on the Hill.
Hmm.
And this is the house
Wow.
that
That gave
she's,
me goosebumps.
there you go. And that's the house that she's referring to. And she, of course, comes to prominence in the 60s uh, following the bombing of the church in Mississippi. She
Mhm.
writes Mississippi Goddam, which becomes almost an album, and sorry, an anthem during the civil rights era. And then when Martin Luther King is assassinated, she actually writes a song for him,
Hmm.
which becomes another type of anthem. But that long struggle, um, embodied in a house to be found on an island stuck out in the mid Atlantic.
Wow.
And that is the intersection. Um,
And it's not just an intersection, it's a direct connection
and a direct
between
connection.
Barbados and the United States.
Yep.
That's
Yeah, that's it.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
So Kevin, on Nina Simone, I have a personal connection. I saw her in concert live in Seattle in
Wow.
1998, and it was an incredible life experience that I'll never forget. She was very advanced in age. She came out in a walker, and
Okay.
then she blew the audience away with her powerful voice and her amazing lyrics.
Yep.
And what does she mean to Barbados and and that connection again
Yeah.
back to the United States?
I'll say for those Barbadians who know, especially those people who are into jazz, she means a lot. Um, I can try to confirm it, but I think she would have gone down to the Bel Air Jazz Club, which was where a lot of the jazz musicians and other musicians would go to after they played their gigs
Mm.
in the 70s. But it's that voice, it's how music changes us, even though we don't recognize that it is. So she would have been played a lot on the radio on Island in the 60s and 70s. So it's almost that type of background music that influences you without pushing you in a particular direction. But then, in the wider context, as a black female musician, when there were very few black female musicians as solo artists, is just another added layer to who she was, and that she was an absolutely amazing person. Difficult at times, but genius normally is.
Like
Because,
many of us.
like many of we wish, but to really make us confront the hard things, and that's what art does.
Mhm.
It's what artists are supposed to.
Yeah.
They're supposed to make us question the really hard things going on around us and in our particular world at the time. And I think that's what she did, and in fact, what she continues to do. Because when you hear her songs today, they're still as fresh and as poignant
Yes.
as they were when they were first recorded. And I think that's really the importance of Nina.
Many young people have not heard of Nina Simone, yet her work is so timeless.
Yeah.
How can we make sure that more people experience her amazing music?
Um, because I have a museum background, I'll always say exhibitions, but concerts. We celebrate International Jazz Day in Barbados every year. Perhaps we can do some programming around her. And those other jazz musicians who specifically geared their messaging towards civil rights and social justice as a form of programming, but then teaching people to play this fantastic music that has as its birthplace the United States, but then really is a world music.
Mm.
And I think that's one of the key ways that we can keep teaching people about her music, but about that musical genre, which has done a lot to break barriers.
So today is Martin Luther King Day,
Yeah.
and that is a very important day in the United States. It's a very important day, really, around the world as a civil rights leader, a champion of human rights. Human rights are a core element of my work and my career. I've spent 30 years working on advancing and championing human rights, and I bring that to my new role as ambassador. Can you reflect on MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., and what his life means, and how our two countries again work together to advance human rights?
Yeah. Um, his life is really an explicit example of once you believe in a cause, you are willing not only to advocate but to pay the ultimate sacrifice for it. And it's one that is almost perennial. We continue to struggle for human rights. Um, and what he started, we've still not fully realized.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important that on MLK Day, we recognize that we still have to continue that fight. And it might seem weird saying that word for someone who preached nonviolence.
Mm-hmm.
So let's use the word activism and be always vigilant to ensure that the rights of people, no matter where they are and who they are maintained. And I think that's the importance of MLK, especially on his birthday. And the resonance of that civil rights movement, the numbers of West Indians directly and indirectly, like Nina, who might have lived in Barbados, um, Stoic Carmichael and others who had West Indian parents, the fact that they advocated for, and we are continuing that advocacy today is necessary because we still haven't achieved it.
Mm-hmm.
And it means that we need to continue that advocacy to ensure that everyone's rights are maintained, um, but also recognized. And I think that's critically important for us as a people.
So, Kevin, what's your message to young people? How can young people engage in a way that um, advances these issues more quickly than is typical?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The first thing that comes to mind, because we live in democracy, is vote. Be active in whatever the politics of your space is. It doesn't necessarily mean having to join a political party, but to be aware and to not only process but to question and to actively question and where possible seek to influence change. Young people do everything via social media, and that right now is really the bullhorn that they use well. I think they should continue to do so, but also arm themselves with not only the facts but history.
Mhm.
We're on a continuum, and if we don't look back to understand what's happened in the past, we sometimes might not choose the right path going forward. But once we understand that history, we can then look forward and chart the path forward. And for me, that's the importance of museums and heritage spaces, that they're there to remind you of that past, but also in a way to implicitly say to you, well, the baton's now being passed on to you, to ensure that we don't revert to what were the bad old days, because the good old days weren't good.
That's right. And that this
And this is
home
a classic
is a
example.
classic example.
Yeah.
Exactly right. So, Kevin, thank you. This
Most
is
welcome.
both illuminating and inspiring. So, thank you so
No,
much.
thanks so much. And thanks for taking the time out.
Of course. Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers. Same.